On the evening of March the 17th, 1982, 16-year-old Helen Walsh opened her mother's jewelry box, looking for her grandmother's pearl earrings, and found a photograph that would shatter her family. The small black and white image showed her mother, Helen Walsh, standing next to an unfamiliar man in what appeared to be Red Square in Moscow. Her mother looked younger, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing distinctly foreign clothing. What made the photograph disturbing was not just that Helen had never mentioned visiting the Soviet Union, but that she had explicitly told Catherine and her younger brother Michael that she had never traveled outside the United States before marrying their father. Catherine stood in her parents' bedroom in their modest split-level home in Vienna, Virginia, holding the photograph with trembling hands. Helen Walsh, 41, had worked for the past 8 years as a secretary at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, with security clearance, allowing her access to classified diplomatic cables and intelligence reports. She drove Michael to soccer practice, helped Catherine with chemistry homework, and made pot roast every Sunday. She had been class mother and volunteered at the local Methodist church. The idea that this woman might be living under a false identity seemed impossible. But Catherine understood that people who had never been to Moscow did not have photographs of themselves standing in Red Square. The Walsh family had moved to Vienna in 1974 when Catherine was 8. Her father, Robert Walsh, was a career Air Force officer assigned to the Pentagon after serving tours in Germany and Southeast Asia. The 44-year-old lieutenant colonel, specializing in logistics, had married Helen in 1963, according to family lore, after meeting her at a church social in Dayton, Ohio, where he had been stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Helen had been working as a secretary at a local insurance company. They had dated for 6 months before Robert proposed, and Helen had followed him through his various military assignments. Their home on Maple Street was indistinguishable from dozens of others in their neighborhood. Helen kept the house meticulously clean, prepared dinner every evening by 6 o'clock, and maintained careful budgets that allowed modest summer vacations to Virginia Beach. Catherine and Michael attended local public schools and participated in normal teenage activities. Helen spoke with no trace of a foreign accent, celebrated American holidays enthusiastically, and seemed genuinely invested in suburban life. Helen's State Department work had begun in 1974 through standard channels, submitting references and undergoing the background investigation required for her security clearance. When approved, she was assigned to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where she typed classified memoranda, maintained filing systems for sensitive documents, and provided administrative support to intelligence analysts producing reports on Soviet military capabilities and Warsaw Pact activities. Catherine had been proud of her mother's work. Helen would occasionally mention office personalities or bureaucratic frustrations in the vague terms that families of government workers accept as normal. She never brought classified documents home and seemed to maintain appropriate boundaries between her professional and personal lives. The photograph showed none of these boundaries. Catherine studied the image carefully, noting her mother's relaxed posture, not like a tourist visiting a foreign country for the first time, and the professional quality suggesting access to better equipment than casual tourists used. Catherine replaced the photograph exactly where she had found it and closed the jewelry box carefully. She walked downstairs to the living room where her parents were watching the evening news and attempted to act normally. Helen sat in her usual chair, wearing a blue housecoat and reading glasses, occasionally commenting on news stories. Robert sat in his recliner, still in his military uniform, making notes in a small notebook, as he often did. The scene was so perfectly ordinary that Catherine found it difficult to reconcile with the possibility that one of her parents might be living a completely fabricated life. Over the following days, Catherine found herself paying closer attention to her mother's behavior. She noticed Helen occasionally received phone calls that made her nervous, conversations taken in the kitchen with the door closed. She observed Helen sometimes stayed late at the State Department for vague reasons. She noticed Helen maintained separate checking and savings accounts that seemed larger than necessary for household expenses. These observations might have seemed innocuous under normal circumstances, but viewed through the lens of Catherine's suspicions, they began to form a pattern. Catherine also began listening more carefully to Helen's stories about her background. Helen had always been vague about her early life, explaining that her parents had died when she was young and that she had been raised by an aunt who had also passed away before Helen met Robert. She claimed to have few memories of her childhood and no remaining family connections in Ohio. Now, Catherine wondered whether these gaps were intentional rather than unfortunate, designed to avoid questions that might reveal information that could not be verified. The breakthrough came on April 3, 1982. While Helen was at work and Robert was traveling on Air Force business, Catherine conducted a systematic search of her parents' bedroom. She found Helen's passport showing entry stamps from several European countries during the 1970s, trips Helen had described as business travel, but which now seemed suspicious. More significantly, Catherine discovered a small metal box hidden behind clothing in Helen's closet, secured with a combination lock that opened using Helen's birthday. Inside were multiple sets of identification papers bearing Helen's photograph, but different names, including one that appeared to be Soviet. There were coded messages on thin paper, photographs of various individuals Catherine didn't recognize, and cash in denominations suggesting payment for services. Most damaging was a letter written in what appeared to be Russian, accompanied by an English translation in Helen's handwriting, discussing intelligence-gathering objectives and reporting procedures clearly related to espionage. Catherine sat on her parents' bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence that her mother was a Soviet agent who had spent nearly 20 years infiltrating American government institutions and stealing classified information. Helen had access to intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and strategic assessments that could compromise American foreign policy and endanger American lives. She was using her position as a trusted government employee to serve the interests of America's primary adversary during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The moral complexity was overwhelming. Helen was her mother, the person Catherine loved most in the world, who had sacrificed countless hours to support Catherine's education and development. But Helen was also committing treason, betraying the trust of her colleagues, and potentially contributing to activities that could harm American military personnel and intelligence officers operating in dangerous locations. For 2 weeks, Catherine struggled with the decision. She considered confronting Helen directly, demanding she cease her activities and confess to authorities. She considered telling her father, hoping his military training might allow him to handle the situation through official channels. She even considered simply replacing the evidence and pretending she had never discovered her mother's secret. None of these alternatives seemed viable. Confronting Helen would give her the opportunity to destroy evidence or flee. Telling Robert would place him in an impossible position where his loyalty to family conflicted with military obligations and might result in accusations that he had been complicit or negligent. Ignoring the evidence would make Catherine an accessory to ongoing treason, while additional classified information was compromised. On April 18, 1982, Catherine called the Federal Bureau of Investigation from a payphone at her high school and requested to speak with someone about a matter of national security. The agent who took her call initially assumed she was making a prank call, but Catherine's detailed knowledge of State Department procedures and her calm, factual presentation convinced the agent that her claims required investigation. Catherine was told to remain at the school and that agents would meet her within 30 minutes. Special Agent Patricia Morrison and Special Agent David Chen arrived at approximately 2:15 p.m. and spent the next 3 hours interviewing Catherine. Morrison, a 12-year veteran of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, had extensive experience investigating Soviet intelligence operations. Chen took detailed notes as Catherine described the photograph, the metal box contents, and her mother's suspicious behavior patterns. Both agents recognized that Catherine's information represented a significant counterintelligence opportunity. The agents asked Catherine to provide detailed information about Helen's daily routines, work schedule, social contacts, and travel patterns. Catherine found herself describing intimate details of her mother's life to strangers, providing information she knew would be used to build a case, resulting in Helen's arrest and imprisonment. The agents assured Catherine that her cooperation was essential to protecting national security and that she was acting with courage and patriotism. But Catherine felt no sense of heroism, only growing awareness that she had set in motion events that would destroy everything she had previously understood about her family and identity. The FBI initiated round-the-clock surveillance of Helen Walsh on April 19, 1982. The first indication that Helen was indeed engaged in espionage came on April 23rd when surveillance teams observed her making an unscheduled stop at a small park in Arlington during her drive home from work. Helen parked near a walking trail, retrieved what appeared to be a small package from beneath a designated bench, and replaced it with a different package before driving home. The surveillance team photographed the entire exchange and later retrieved the package Helen had left, which contained photographs of classified State Department documents related to American intelligence assessments of Soviet military capabilities in Eastern Europe. The FBI's document analysis confirmed that Helen had been systematically photographing classified materials and transferring them to Soviet handlers using a network of dead drops throughout the Washington metropolitan area. Additional surveillance documented Helen's participation in a sophisticated intelligence network that included at least 3 other individuals working in sensitive government positions. During this period, Catherine continued living at home, maintaining the pretense of normal family life while knowing that federal agents were monitoring their house and preparing to arrest her mother. She sat at dinner conversations where Helen discussed her workday, knowing Helen was lying. She listened to Helen help Michael with homework, watched her iron Roberts uniforms, and observed thousands of small domestic interactions that had once seemed natural but now appeared as elements of an elaborate performance. The psychological strain began to affect Catherine's behavior. She became withdrawn and anxious, spending more time alone in her room and showing less interest in social activities. Her grades declined as she found it difficult to concentrate. When Helen expressed concern about Catherine's apparent depression and suggested counseling, Catherine found herself in the surreal position of being comforted by the woman she was helping to destroy. Special Agent Morrison maintained regular contact with Catherine throughout the surveillance period, meeting her at various locations to brief her on the investigation's progress. Morrison understood the extraordinary psychological pressure Catherine was experiencing and attempted to provide support while maintaining professional boundaries. On May 15, 1982, FBI surveillance teams observed Helen Walsh meeting with a man later identified as Viktor Petrov, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. The meeting took place in a shopping mall food court in Bethesda, Maryland, where Helen and Petrov sat at adjacent tables and exchanged casual conversation while Helen passed documents to Petrov in a manila envelope disguised as shopping materials. This direct observation of Helen transferring classified information to a known Soviet intelligence officer provided the evidence necessary to justify her arrest and prosecution under federal espionage statutes. Catherine was informed of the planned arrest during a meeting with Agent Morrison on the afternoon of May 17th at a coffee shop near her high school. Morrison explained that Helen would be arrested the following morning and that search warrants had been obtained for the family's home and Helen's office. That evening, Catherine sat with her family during what she knew would be their last dinner together as they had existed for 16 years. Helen served pot roast with vegetables while discussing plans for Catherine's upcoming graduation and Michael's summer baseball schedule. Robert described his current Pentagon assignment. Michael complained about his chemistry teacher and asked for help with a World War II research project. The conversation was utterly mundane, and Catherine found herself memorizing details because she understood that this version of her family was about to cease to exist. At approximately 8:30 a.m. on May 18, 1982, Special Agent Morrison and 5 other FBI agents arrested Helen Walsh in the State Department parking garage as she arrived for work. Helen offered no resistance and made no statements other than requesting an attorney, behavior consistent with someone trained in intelligence tradecraft. Simultaneously, FBI agents executed search warrants at the Walsh family home, seizing documents, photographs, communications equipment, and other evidence. Robert Walsh, preparing to leave for work, was informed that his wife had been arrested on charges of espionage and that the house was being searched as part of a national security investigation. Catherine and Michael were both at school but were contacted by administrators and asked to return home immediately. Catherine understood what was happening, but Michael, 13, and unaware of any problems, had no context for understanding why FBI agents were searching his house and why his father appeared to be in shock. Robert attempted to explain the situation to both children, but found himself unable to articulate what had occurred because he was still processing it himself. The impact on Michael was immediate and devastating. He had no preparation for learning that his mother was a Soviet spy, no framework for understanding how such deception was possible. Michael's response was complete denial, insisting the FBI had made a mistake. He became angry with Catherine when she seemed to accept the charges as true, accusing her of betrayal and demanding to know why she wasn't defending Helen. Robert's response was more complex, reflecting his military training and security clearance. His initial shock gave way to careful analysis of Helen's behavior over their 19 years of marriage, searching for signs he might have overlooked. He began recognizing patterns that now seemed suspicious. Helen's reluctance to discuss her childhood, her occasional nervousness around certain phone calls, her detailed knowledge of political developments. Robert found himself questioning every aspect of his relationship with Helen, wondering whether her love for him and the children had been genuine or merely part of her cover identity. Most difficult was the realization that his security clearance and military career would be subjected to intensive review to determine whether he had been complicit in Helen's activities or negligent in failing to detect them. Robert understood that even if cleared of wrongdoing, his career would likely be permanently damaged by his association with a convicted spy. Helen's interrogation by FBI counterintelligence agents began that afternoon and continued for several days. Helen initially refused to answer questions without her attorney, but eventually began providing information about her background and activities in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. The information she provided confirmed Catherine's discoveries and revealed the extensive nature of her intelligence activities over nearly 2 decades. According to Helen's statements, she had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while studying in Moscow as an exchange student in 1959 during a program designed to improve cultural understanding between American and Soviet universities. Helen Kowalski, her original name, had been a junior at Ohio State University, majoring in Russian language and literature when selected for the exchange program. During her year in Moscow, KGB officers had identified her as a potential asset due to her language skills, academic performance, and family background, which included financial difficulties that made her susceptible to monetary incentives. The recruitment process was gradual and sophisticated, beginning with social invitations and cultural activities that allowed KGB officers to assess Helen's personality and motivations. When Helen expressed interest in continuing her Russian studies, her handlers suggested she might contribute to improved understanding between the two countries by sharing observations about American attitudes toward the Soviet Union. Helen's formal recruitment occurred near the end of her exchange program. She was provided training in basic intelligence techniques, photography, coded communications, and dead-drop procedures, and practiced these during supervised exercises in Moscow before returning to the United States. Her handlers emphasized that her initial contributions would be limited to observations about American public opinion and academic perspectives, information that seemed relatively harmless. The transformation of Helen Kowalski into Helen Walsh was accomplished through forged documents and carefully constructed background stories. Soviet intelligence provided documentation showing birth in Ohio, educational credentials, and references that supported her applications for jobs and security clearances. The identity allowed Helen to move freely within American society while avoiding connections to people who might have known Helen Kowalski before her recruitment. Helen's marriage to Robert Walsh had been opportunistic rather than planned, occurring when she met him at the church social in Dayton, where she had been establishing her cover identity. Soviet intelligence encouraged the relationship when Helen reported meeting a military officer, understanding that marriage to someone with security clearances might eventually provide access to classified information. Helen's statements to FBI investigators suggested her feelings for Robert had been genuine initially, but her loyalty to Soviet handlers had remained paramount throughout their marriage. The intelligence Helen provided to Soviet handlers over nearly 2 decades included thousands of classified documents related to American assessments of Soviet military capabilities, diplomatic cables regarding U.S. negotiations with Warsaw Pact countries, and strategic evaluations that allowed Soviet planners to anticipate American responses to international crises. The FBI and CIA damage assessment concluded that Helen's contributions had compromised numerous American intelligence operations, endangered assets in Eastern Europe, and provided Soviet leaders with detailed knowledge of American strategic thinking during critical Cold War periods. The legal proceedings against Helen Walsh began in federal court in Alexandria, Virginia, in September 1982. Helen's attorney negotiated a plea agreement that allowed Helen to avoid trial in exchange for cooperation with ongoing counterintelligence investigations and acceptance of a prison sentence of 25 years without possibility of parole. The plea hearing on October 15, 1982, provided the first public acknowledgement of Helen's activities. Federal prosecutors described her intelligence contributions in general terms, avoiding specific details that might compromise ongoing investigations. Helen's statement to the court was brief and formal, acknowledging her guilt and expressing regret without providing details about her motivations or the personal impact on her family. Catherine attended the plea hearing, sitting in the courtroom gallery and watching her mother accept responsibility for crimes Catherine had discovered and reported. The experience was surreal and devastating. Catherine had expected to feel some sense of vindication or closure from Helen's confession, but instead felt only grief for the loss of the mother she thought she knew, and guilt over her role in Helen's prosecution. Robert also attended, wearing his military dress uniform and sitting separately from Catherine and Michael, who had refused to come. Robert's presence was both a statement of support for the legal process and an acknowledgement that his marriage to Helen was effectively over. His military career had survived the security review, but he had been reassigned to duties that did not require the same level of security clearances, effectively ending his advancement potential. Michael's refusal to attend reflected his continued difficulty accepting the reality of his mother's activities and his anger toward Catherine for initiating the investigation that destroyed their family. At 13, Michael was struggling with adolescent challenges complicated by the trauma of learning that his fundamental assumptions about his family were false. He blamed Catherine for their mother's imprisonment, reasoning that Helen's espionage might have continued indefinitely without harming the family if Catherine had simply ignored what she discovered. The relationship between Catherine and Michael deteriorated significantly, with Michael viewing Catherine as responsible for their family's destruction and Catherine struggling to explain her decision. Catherine attempted to help Michael understand the national security implications and the moral obligation she had felt, but Michael was unable to process these abstract concepts in the face of the immediate and concrete loss of his mother and the disintegration of his family life. Helen was sentenced to federal prison and began serving her term at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. The prison allowed limited contact with family through supervised visits and monitored telephone calls, but Helen's communications were subject to ongoing review by FBI counterintelligence agents still investigating her intelligence network. Catherine visited her mother in prison twice during the first year of Helen's incarceration. Helen appeared to be adjusting to prison life, participating in educational programs and maintaining correspondence with supporters who believed her prosecution was excessive. But conversations with Catherine were stilted and careful, reflecting both the monitored nature of their communications and Helen's apparent uncertainty about Catherine's motivations. During their second visit in April 1983, Helen asked Catherine directly why she had chosen to report her activities rather than confronting her about the evidence. Catherine attempted to explain her reasoning, describing her sense of duty to country and her belief that Helen's espionage was causing harm to American interests and potentially endangering American lives. Helen listened without comment, but her expression suggested both disappointment and resigned understanding. Helen also asked about Michael and Robert, expressing particular concern about Michael's emotional state. Catherine reported that Michael continued to blame her and that Robert was struggling to rebuild his life following the security review and public attention. Helen encouraged Catherine to maintain her relationship with Michael and to assure Robert that her espionage activities had been entirely her own decision. Robert divorced Helen in 1984, retaining custody of Michael. Catherine, 18 and graduated from high school, chose to attend college at a state university in Florida, partly to pursue her educational goals and partly to distance herself from the ongoing consequences of her decision. The geographic separation allowed Catherine to begin processing the psychological impact of her role in Helen's prosecution, but also intensified her feelings of isolation and uncertainty about whether she had made the correct decision. Catherine's college experience was complicated by her need to conceal her family background from friends and romantic interests, understanding that her mother's conviction for espionage would influence how people viewed her. Michael's adjustment to high school and adolescence was severely impacted by his family's destruction and the public attention surrounding Helen's case. Although prosecutors and FBI agents had attempted to minimize publicity, Helen's arrest and conviction had been covered by media, making it impossible for Michael to avoid classmates' awareness. Michael found himself defending Helen's actions to people who viewed her as a traitor, while simultaneously struggling with his own confusion about how to reconcile his memories of Helen as a loving mother with the evidence of her espionage. Robert retired from the Air Force in 1985, earlier than planned, and relocated to a small town in North Carolina, where he hoped to establish a new life away from Washington. He found work as a civilian logistics coordinator for a defense contractor. He maintained minimal contact with Helen, communicating only when necessary for legal or financial matters. Helen's life in prison settled into routines that provided some stability, but little hope for early release. She participated in educational programs, earning a bachelor's degree in literature through correspondence courses and working as a tutor for other inmates. Her letters to Catherine and Michael became less frequent over time, partly due to their limited responses and partly due to her understanding that maintaining contact might be causing them additional emotional difficulty. In 1987, 5 years after Helen's arrest, Catherine graduated from college with a degree in journalism and began working for a small newspaper in Florida. She was drawn to investigative reporting, partly because of her family experience, and partly because she felt compelled to pursue truth-seeking work that might provide some sense of purpose. Catherine's work focused on local government accountability and public safety issues. She never wrote about her family's experience or used her insider knowledge of espionage cases in her professional work, maintaining strict boundaries between her personal history and professional responsibilities. Michael graduated from high school in 1987 and enrolled at a state university in North Carolina to study engineering, choosing technical fields that would not require extensive background investigations. Michael's relationship with Catherine remained strained, though they maintained minimal contact through birthday cards and occasional phone calls that were carefully neutral. The long-term psychological impact on Michael included persistent feelings of abandonment and betrayal that affected his ability to form trusting relationships throughout his adult life. Michael's romantic relationships were complicated by his reluctance to discuss his family background and his fear that revealing his mother's conviction would result in rejection or suspicion. He eventually married a woman who knew about Helen's case and accepted it as part of Michael's background, but their relationship was affected by Michael's ongoing difficulties with trust and emotional intimacy. Robert remarried in 1988. Choosing a widow with adult children who provided companionship without requiring him to navigate the complexities of raising additional children while dealing with the consequences of Helen's case. Robert's second marriage was stable and provided emotional support, but he never discussed Helen's case with his new wife or her family. In 1995, 13 years after Helen's arrest, Catherine received a phone call from federal prison officials informing her that Helen had been diagnosed with breast cancer and was receiving treatment at the prison medical facility. The cancer was advanced, and doctors estimated Helen might live for 6 months to 2 years. Catherine faced a decision about whether to visit Helen during what might be her final period of life. Catherine decided to visit Helen in prison, traveling to Connecticut for what she expected might be her final conversation with her mother. Helen appeared physically weakened by cancer treatment, but mentally alert. Their conversation lasted several hours and covered topics they had never previously discussed, including Helen's motivations for her espionage activities, her feelings about Catherine's decision to report her to federal authorities, and her hopes for Catherine's and Michael's futures. Helen explained that her espionage had been motivated initially by genuine belief in Soviet political ideologies and opposition to American foreign policies she viewed as imperialistic and harmful to global peace. Over time, her motivations evolved to include loyalty to Soviet handlers who had become her primary emotional connections and commitment to work she viewed as historically significant. Helen acknowledged that her activities had caused harm to American interests and potentially endangered American lives, but maintained that she believed she was contributing to a more peaceful world by providing Soviet leaders with accurate information about American capabilities and intentions. Regarding Catherine's decision, Helen expressed a complex mixture of understanding and regret. She acknowledged that Catherine had faced an impossible choice between loyalty to family and duty to country, and that Catherine's decision had been morally consistent with the values Helen herself had taught her children about honesty and integrity. But Helen also expressed sadness that Catherine had not trusted her enough to confront her directly, which might have allowed Helen to cease her activities and minimize harm to the family. Helen's hopes for Catherine's and Michael's futures focused on their ability to build meaningful lives independent of their family's history and their capacity to forgive themselves and each other. Helen expressed particular concern about Michael's ongoing anger toward Catherine, encouraging Catherine to continue attempting to repair their relationship despite Michael's reluctance. Helen also encouraged Catherine to pursue romantic relationships and family life without allowing their family history to prevent her from experiencing normal emotional connections. Helen died in federal prison in September 1996, 14 years after her arrest and conviction. Catherine and Michael both attended her funeral, conducted at a small chapel near the prison with minimal attendance and no media coverage. The service provided Catherine and Michael with their first opportunity to interact as adults since their family's destruction, but their conversation remained limited and focused on practical arrangements rather than emotional reconciliation. Following Helen's death, Catherine and Michael attempted to rebuild their relationship through occasional phone calls and annual meetings, but the damage proved difficult to overcome. Michael continued to blame Catherine for Helen's imprisonment and death in prison, reasoning that Helen might have lived longer and more comfortably if she had been able to serve a shorter sentence or receive early release. Catherine continued to believe that reporting Helen's activities had been morally necessary, but also experienced ongoing guilt about her role in her family's destruction. In 2003, 21 years after Helen's arrest, Michael contacted Catherine to inform her that he had decided to legally change his last name, dropping Walsh in favor of his wife's maiden name. Michael explained that he wanted to protect his young children from the possibility that their grandfather's connection to a convicted spy might someday affect their opportunities or social relationships. Catherine's response was to respect his decision while expressing sadness that their family's trauma continued to influence major life decisions more than 2 decades after the original events. Catherine had chosen to keep her maiden name throughout her career and personal life, viewing it as part of her identity and responsibility rather than something to be hidden. The difference in their approaches reflected the fundamental disagreement between Catherine and Michael about whether her decision to report Helen had been justified. Robert Walsh died in 2008 at age 70, having lived his final years in relative peace with his second wife and limited contact with Catherine and Michael. Robert's obituary made no mention of Helen or the espionage case, describing him simply as a retired Air Force officer and defense contractor who had served his country with distinction. The FBI's damage assessment of Helen's espionage activities remained classified, but declassified documents released in 2010 revealed that her intelligence contributions had been more extensive than originally acknowledged publicly. Helen had provided Soviet handlers with detailed information about American intelligence operations in Eastern Europe, diplomatic negotiations regarding nuclear weapons limitations, and strategic assessments that influenced American defense spending and military planning during critical Cold War periods. The documents also revealed that Helen's intelligence network had included at least 5 other individuals working in sensitive government positions, some of whom had never been identified or prosecuted. Catherine learned about these declassified revelations through her work as an investigative journalist, and the information confirmed her belief that Helen's espionage had been significant enough to justify the family trauma that resulted from reporting it. But the knowledge also intensified Catherine's awareness of the broader consequences of her decision, including the possibility that individuals she had never met had been arrested or had their lives disrupted because of information Helen provided to investigators following Catherine's initial report. In 2012, 30 years after the events that destroyed her family, Catherine published a memoir describing her experience and reflecting on the moral complexities of her decision. The book was well received by critics and readers, praised for its honest examination of impossible choices and its refusal to provide simple answers to complex moral questions. Catherine used proceeds from the book to establish a scholarship fund for children of government employees, particularly those affected by national security investigations. Michael's response to Catherine's memoir was negative, interpreting it as an attempt to profit from their family's trauma and to justify decisions that had caused lasting harm. Michael gave several interviews to media outlets criticizing Catherine's book and maintaining that her decision to report Helen had been wrong. The public nature of Michael's criticism marked the final breakdown of any possibility for reconciliation between them. Catherine's memoir sparked broader discussion about the responsibilities of family members who discover evidence of criminal activity, particularly in cases involving national security. Legal scholars, ethicists, and intelligence professionals debated whether Catherine's decision had been morally justified and what factors should influence such choices in the future. The discussions revealed the complexity of balancing loyalty to family against duty to country, with reasonable people reaching different conclusions based on their values and priorities. The question of responsibility in cases like Catherine's is complicated because it requires assigning accountability among individuals who were all, to some degree, acting according to the values and systems they believed in. Can a 16-year-old be held responsible for not understanding the full consequences of reporting criminal activity? Can a mother be excused for putting her children in an impossible situation by engaging in espionage while maintaining a family? Can a 13-year-old be blamed for feeling abandoned by the sister who destroyed his family in service of abstract principles? These questions have no easy answers because they involve fundamental conflicts between competing moral obligations. The duty to protect national security versus the obligation to preserve family relationships, the responsibility to report criminal activity versus the imperative to avoid causing harm to innocent people, the value of loyalty versus the importance of integrity. Helen Walsh chose espionage over family security, placing her children in danger of exactly the trauma they eventually experienced. She made this choice repeatedly over nearly 20 years, understanding that discovery would destroy her family, but continuing her intelligence activities because she prioritized her political beliefs and loyalty to Soviet handlers over her obligations to her husband and children. Michael Walsh chose to blame Catherine rather than Helen for their family's destruction, a psychologically understandable response that allowed him to maintain his image of Helen as a loving mother while directing his anger toward someone who was available and vulnerable. Michael's choice protected him from some psychological pain, but also prevented him from developing a complete understanding of their family situation and ultimately limited his ability to heal from his trauma. Robert Walsh chose to rebuild his life after Helen's arrest, remarrying and attempting to move forward rather than remaining focused on the betrayal and loss he had experienced. Robert's choice allowed him to find some happiness during his later years, but also meant that he was never able to provide Catherine and Michael with the parental support they needed to process their trauma and maintain their relationship as siblings. Catherine Walsh was 16 years old when she discovered evidence that her mother was a Soviet spy. She was 34 when Helen died in federal prison. And in between, Catherine lost her mother, her brother, her father's respect, and her fundamental assumptions about loyalty, love, and moral responsibility. The question of whether her choice was right or wrong remains unanswerable because it depends on values and priorities that reasonable people will always weigh differently.